ICE Agent Derek Morrison had been with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for 6 years when he walked into a situation that would destroy his career and cost the federal government $4.5 million. He was 34 years old, experienced enough to understand constitutional protections, but apparently convinced that his authority to demand papers superseded all other considerations. One Thursday afternoon at Columbia University, he received a call about a suspicious individual who allegedly looked out of place in the faculty building. The suspicious individual was Dr. Marcus Rivera, a tenured professor of constitutional law who had literally written the federal guidelines governing immigration enforcement procedures. What Morrison did next, demanding citizenship papers from an American citizen, ignoring university credentials, and detaining a law professor in front of his own students, would become proof that even writing the law isn't enough to protect you from agents who don't understand it. Morrison's actions that day violated the very protocols Dr. Rivera had authored. The irony was devastating. The professor who'd spent a decade crafting immigration enforcement procedures designed to prevent exactly this kind of constitutional violation was now experiencing those violations firsthand. And when the dust settled, Morrison would be terminated, the Department of Homeland Security would pay $4.5 million, and a university would have video evidence of federal agents who didn't know the law they were supposed to enforce. A Latino man in his early 40s, Dr. Marcus Rivera, was walking across the Columbia University campus toward his office in Jerome Green Hall on a crisp October afternoon. His faculty ID badge was clipped to his jacket pocket. His briefcase contained lecture notes for his 3-hour PM constitutional law seminar. No crime, no immigration violation, no suspicious behavior, just a professor heading to teach a class. But Agent Morrison saw him through a filter so distorted by assumptions about who belongs in academic spaces that he couldn't process a Latino man as a legitimate faculty member. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Columbia University's Morningside Heights campus sits on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, stretching across 36 acres of some of the most prestigious academic real estate in America. Jerome Green Hall houses the law school, a limestone building with Gothic Revival architecture that exudes intellectual authority. It's the kind of place where future Supreme Court justices study, where constitutional scholars debate, where the brightest legal minds gather to shape American jurisprudence. It was 2:38 p.m. on a Thursday in October. The autumn air was crisp, with leaves turning golden across the campus quad. Students hurried between buildings, backpacks slung over shoulders, focused on afternoon seminars and study groups. The usual rhythm of academic life was in full swing. Professors walked briskly toward lecture halls, legal texts tucked under arms, preparing for classes that would challenge the next generation of lawyers. The faculty building was particularly busy. Law school classes were about to begin, students clustered near entrances, checking phones, reviewing notes, discussing cases they'd read the night before. The atmosphere hummed with intellectual energy, the kind of focused intensity that comes when brilliant minds gather in one place. Dr. Marcus Rivera's path took him along the main walkway toward the law school entrance. He'd made this walk thousands of times over the past 8 years. Today felt like any other. Lecture to prepare, students to teach, legal concepts to illuminate. The kind of afternoon where nothing dramatic typically happens in academic settings. But someone had been watching. Someone had decided that a Latino man walking purposefully toward a law school building didn't belong there. Someone had made a phone call. Dr. Marcus Rivera had been a professor at Columbia Law School for 8 years. 8 years teaching constitutional law, immigration policy, and federal enforcement procedures. He'd authored 3 textbooks on constitutional protections for immigrants, published 47 peer-reviewed articles in legal journals, and testified before Congress on immigration reform. His colleagues called him brilliant. His students called him the professor who made constitutional law understandable. Rivera had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, where he'd served as editor of the Harvard Law Review and written his thesis on Fourth Amendment protections in immigration enforcement. After graduation, he'd clerked for a federal appellate judge, then spent 5 years with the ACLU's Immigrants' Rights Project, litigating cases that established precedent for constitutional protections during immigration enforcement. His work had resulted in Supreme Court citations and changes to federal enforcement protocols. But Rivera's most significant contribution came during his transition to academia. Between 2015 and 2017, he'd served as a consultant to the Department of Homeland Security, tasked with rewriting immigration enforcement guidelines to ensure constitutional compliance. His 847-page manual, Constitutional Standards for Immigration Enforcement Operations, had become the definitive training document for ICE agents. Every agent was supposed to study it. Every supervisor was supposed to enforce it. The guidelines Rivera wrote specifically prohibited ethnic profiling, required probable cause for detention, and mandated respect for university campuses as educational spaces. At 42 years old, Dr. Marcus Rivera was exactly where he'd worked to be, a nationally recognized expert whose scholarship directly shaped federal policy. He lived in a brownstone near campus with his wife and 2 teenage daughters. He spoke at conferences across the country, served on editorial boards of major legal journals, and was frequently quoted in the New York Times and the Washington Post when immigration policy made headlines. Rivera was also a naturalized American citizen. Born in El Salvador, he'd immigrated with his parents at age 7. He'd become a citizen at 18, immediately after high school graduation, in a ceremony where he'd sworn the oath of allegiance with tears in his eyes. He'd spent the next 24 years earning degrees, building his career, and contributing to American legal scholarship. His naturalization certificate hung framed in his office next to his Harvard diploma and a photo of him shaking hands with the Chief Justice. That Thursday, Rivera had been on campus since 8:01 a.m., attending a faculty meeting about curriculum changes and grading 24 constitutional law exams. He'd grabbed lunch at the faculty cafeteria, spent an hour in his office reviewing Supreme Court cases for his afternoon seminar, and was now walking to Jerome Green Hall to teach his 3:00 p.m. class on Fourth Amendment protections. He wore a navy blazer over khaki pants and a white button-down shirt. Standard professor attire. His faculty ID badge was visible on his jacket pocket. His briefcase contained his lecture notes, copies of Miranda v. Arizona and Terry v. Ohio, and a stack of student papers to return. He wasn't carrying his naturalization certificate. Why would he? He was walking across his own workplace. He looked like what he was, a professor heading to teach a law class. He'd done nothing to attract attention. He'd spoken to several colleagues and students during his walk. He belonged exactly where he was. But to someone who'd been watching the campus, Dr. Marcus Rivera's presence was a problem, and that person had decided to call Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE Agent Derek Morrison was 34 years old. He'd been with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for 6 years, transferred from Border Patrol after what his supervisors called an impressive record of apprehensions. He was aggressive, results-oriented, and convinced that unauthorized immigrants were everywhere if you knew how to spot them. His supervisors described him as dedicated but sometimes overzealous in his interpretation of enforcement authority. In 6 years, Morrison had compiled a record that should have triggered immediate retraining. 23 complaints filed with the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General. 23. 15 of them involved allegations of racial profiling, constitutional violations, or detention of American citizens. 8 had been sustained, resulting in written reprimands and mandatory constitutional law training. The other 15 had been closed with insufficient evidence despite witness statements and documentation. Morrison had a pattern. He interpreted looking suspicious as justification for immigration enforcement. A Latino construction worker eating lunch in a park. Morrison demanded papers and detained him for 2 hours before discovering he was a naturalized citizen. A group of Asian students speaking Mandarin near a university, Morrison approached them, assuming they were unauthorized despite their student visas being valid. A family speaking Spanish at a grocery store, Morrison followed them to the parking lot and questioned their immigration status without probable cause. The pattern was documented, the training was extensive, the constitutional violations were clear, but somehow Morrison remained in field operations, responding to calls, making arrests, interpreting federal law according to his own biased assumptions. Morrison's understanding of immigration law was selective and dangerous. He knew he could demand identification from anyone he suspected of being undocumented. He knew he could detain people for immigration status verification, What he didn't understand, or chose to ignore, was that reasonable suspicion required specific, articulable facts, not ethnic appearance or language use. He'd attended the required constitutional training seminars, but he'd never internalized the limitations on his authority. That Thursday at 2:15 p.m., Morrison received a call from someone who'd been watching Columbia University campus. The caller reported a suspicious individual who looked out of place near the law school building. A Latino man, approximately 40 years old, walking purposefully toward the faculty entrance. The caller didn't specify what made the person suspicious beyond ethnicity and location. In Morrison's mind, the call confirmed his assumptions about unauthorized immigrants infiltrating spaces where they didn't belong. Universities were full of undocumented students and faculty using fake credentials. This was exactly the kind of lead that produced apprehensions. He didn't consider that a Latino man near a law school might be a professor. He didn't think about the constitutional protections that applied on university campuses. He just saw an opportunity to make an arrest. Morrison arrived on campus at 2:35 p.m., parking his unmarked vehicle near the law school. His badge and ICE credentials were visible on his belt. His service weapon was holstered but obvious. He immediately began scanning for someone who matched the description: Latino, male, 40s, walking purposefully. His eyes landed on Dr. Marcus Rivera, walking toward Jerome Green Hall. In Morrison's mind, everything confirmed the call. Latino male, right age, wrong place. The man was carrying a briefcase, probably fake documents. He was walking confidently, probably trained to act like he belonged. Morrison didn't see a professor, he saw a target. He approached Rivera directly, hand resting on his badge, ready to assert federal authority. In Morrison's experience, most unauthorized immigrants cooperated when confronted with ICE credentials. This would be quick and clean. Do you think ICE agents should face consequences for demanding citizenship papers from American citizens? Drop your answer below. Dr. Rivera was reviewing his mental notes for his constitutional law seminar when he became aware of someone approaching him aggressively. He looked up and saw a man in business casual clothing with a badge and gun visible on his belt, walking directly toward him with obvious purpose. "Sir, we need to see your identification and proof of citizenship." Rivera stopped walking, his mind immediately recognizing what was happening. He'd studied hundreds of cases exactly like this. He'd written the federal guidelines specifically to prevent this scenario. "Excuse me, I'm just heading to my office. You match the description of someone reported as suspicious. We need to verify your legal status." Rivera gestured toward Jerome Green Hall, then pointed to his faculty badge. "I work here. I'm a professor at this university." Morrison's eyes flicked to the badge, but his expression didn't change. Campus security badges meant nothing. Anyone could print fake identification. "We'll determine that. Do you have documentation proving you're in this country legally?" Rivera felt the familiar frustration that came when constitutional law met ignorant enforcement. "This is ridiculous. I'm Dr. Marcus Rivera. I teach constitutional law." Morrison pulled out his ICE credentials and held them up. "We need to see papers proving citizenship or legal residency status. You're making a serious mistake." The conversation was beginning to attract attention. Students walking past slowed down, sensing tension. A few pulled out phones. This was Columbia Law School. Everyone here understood constitutional violations when they saw them. "Are you refusing to comply with a federal immigration investigation?" Rivera knew he was at a crossroads. He could assert his Fourth Amendment rights and risk escalation, or he could comply with an unconstitutional demand to end this quickly. "I'm not refusing anything. I'm telling you, I'm an American citizen and a law professor. Show me proof, or you're coming with us for processing." Rivera reached into his briefcase and pulled out his faculty ID, his driver's license, and his Columbia identification card. He held them up. "Here's my faculty identification, my New York driver's license, and my university credentials. I'm a tenured professor of constitutional law." Morrison glanced at the documents. Driver's licenses and university IDs could be forged. He'd seen fake documents before. "These don't prove citizenship status. I need to see a birth certificate, naturalization papers, or a passport." Rivera's voice remained calm, but carried an edge of authority. "I wrote the immigration enforcement guidelines you're supposedly following." Morrison's jaw tightened. He'd heard various claims before. People desperate to avoid detention would say anything. "I don't care if you wrote the Constitution. Papers. Now." This is where bias becomes impenetrable. Agent Morrison had responded to a call about a suspicious Latino man on a university campus. When he arrived, he saw a Latino man on a university campus. In his mind, that confirmed the complaint. Every piece of evidence after that, the faculty credentials, the calm legal language, the professional demeanor, was filtered through his initial assumption. He wasn't looking at a constitutional law professor. He was looking at someone with sophisticated fake documents. Students had begun gathering nearby. Someone called out, "Professor Rivera, is everything okay?" Another voice said, "This is Dr. Rivera. He's my constitutional law professor." Morrison ignored them. He'd learned not to trust witnesses who might be sympathetic to unauthorized immigrants. Should officers be required to verify university employment before detaining professors on campus? Let me know what you think. Rivera realized this was escalating beyond reason. He pulled out his cell phone. "I'm calling University Security and the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General to report this constitutional violation." Morrison stepped closer, his hand moving toward his handcuffs. "Put the phone down. You're interfering with a federal investigation. I'm documenting a federal agent who doesn't understand the law he's supposed to enforce. Put your hands behind your back. You're being detained for immigration status verification." Rivera knew his rights. He also knew that physically resisting would give Morrison justification for force. "You're detaining an American citizen without probable cause. This violates the Fourth Amendment and the guidelines I wrote for your department. Turn around. Hands behind your back." Rivera chose compliance under protest. "I'm complying under duress. I'm Dr. Marcus Rivera, professor of constitutional law at Columbia University. Agent Morrison is detaining me without legal justification. Everyone here is witnessing this federal civil rights violation." Morrison placed handcuffs on Rivera's wrists, not tight enough to cause injury, but tight enough to establish control. The crowd of students and faculty had grown to nearly 20 people. Phones were recording from multiple angles. "You're under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation and failure to provide immigration documentation. I'm an American citizen being arrested for teaching constitutional law while Latino." A student shouted from the crowd, "This is Professor Rivera. He literally teaches the Constitution." Another called out, "He's famous. He's written textbooks." A faculty member pushed through the crowd. "Agent Morrison, I'm Professor Chen from the Political Science Department. Dr. Rivera is a tenured faculty member here. He's a naturalized citizen and a constitutional law expert. You're making a serious mistake." Morrison ignored her completely, his focus fixed on getting Rivera into custody. A law student with her phone out called loudly, "Professor Rivera taught us about unlawful detention just last week. This is exactly what he said would violate the Fourth Amendment." More voices joined in. "This is insane. He's literally on the university website. Someone call the dean." The crowd had swelled to over 30 people, students, faculty, staff, all witnessing what they recognized as a constitutional violation in real time. Morrison guided Rivera toward his vehicle, still handcuffed, his briefcase left behind on the sidewalk where a graduate student quickly secured it. The crowd followed, phones up, recording everything. Several people were live streaming on social media. "Agent Morrison," Rivera said, reading the name on Morrison's badge, "you are violating the constitutional rights of an American citizen and the federal guidelines for immigration enforcement. This will end your career." Morrison opened the back door of his unmarked car. "Get in. I want your badge number, your supervisor's name, and the name of whoever called this in. You'll get all that after we verify your status." As Morrison's car pulled away from the law school, Rivera looked back at the crowd of students and faculty. Multiple people were already on their phones, calling administrators, calling lawyers, calling reporters. Professor Chen was speaking rapidly into her cell phone, likely contacting university legal counsel. The story was spreading in real time across multiple platforms. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Associate Dean of Columbia Law School, arrived at the campus security office within 15 minutes of receiving calls from students. She was a 20-year veteran of academic administration who dealt with every conceivable campus crisis, but never had federal agents arrested one of her faculty members. Martinez immediately contacted university legal counsel, then called the Department of Homeland Security regional office. Meanwhile, Rivera was being processed at the federal building in Lower Manhattan. He was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell, while Morrison filed paperwork for immigration status verification. Rivera used his one phone call to contact his attorney, who immediately began making calls to DHS headquarters. The verification process that should have taken 30 minutes stretched to 3 hours. Morrison submitted Rivera's fingerprints to immigration databases, conducted background checks, and searched for any record of immigration violations. Every database came back with the same result. Dr. Marcus Rivera, naturalized United States citizen, no immigration violations, no criminal record, extensive federal government clearance for his consulting work. At 6:17 p.m., Morrison's supervisor, Assistant Director Jennifer Walsh, arrived at the processing center with information that made her stomach drop. She was a 15-year veteran who'd supervised dozens of agents and seen plenty of constitutional mistakes, but rarely one this legally catastrophic. Walsh approached Morrison with barely contained frustration. She'd spent the afternoon fielding calls from the Department of Homeland Security Office of General Counsel, Columbia University's legal department, and the American Civil Liberties Union. "Morrison, what exactly did you arrest Dr. Rivera for?" Morrison's explanation was confident and defensive. "Suspicious individual reported on university campus. Subject couldn't provide proof of legal immigration status when requested. Standard enforcement action." Walsh picked up Rivera's file and read through the documentation. She made a phone call to verify Rivera's naturalization status, his university employment, and his federal consulting history. The confirmation came back immediately. "Morrison, you arrested a naturalized American citizen, a tenured law professor, and the person who wrote our constitutional enforcement guidelines." Morrison's confidence wavered slightly. He had identification, but anyone can fake documents. Walsh's voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. These weren't fake documents. Dr. Rivera is a United States citizen. He's a law professor at Columbia University, and he literally authored the training manual you were supposed to study about constitutional protections. But the caller said he looked suspicious. Looking suspicious is not probable cause for immigration detention. Looking Latino is not reasonable suspicion of immigration violation, and arresting American citizens is a federal crime. Walsh turned toward Rivera's holding cell. "Dr. Rivera, on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security, I sincerely apologize. This detention was unlawful and inexcusable." Rivera remained silent, building his case. Every word mattered for the lawsuit he was already planning. Walsh turned back to Morrison with an expression of finality. "Badge and weapon. Administrative leave effective immediately. Ma'am, I was responding to a call from a concerned citizen. You violated the constitutional rights of an American citizen. You ignored federal training. You arrested a law professor for being Latino on a university campus. Give me your badge and firearm." Morrison handed them over, his hands shaking. For the first time, he seemed to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. Should ICE agents face automatic termination after wrongful detention of American citizens? Drop your answer. Within 4 hours, the videos had exploded across social media. Students and faculty had captured the entire confrontation from multiple angles. Rivera identifying himself, showing credentials, being handcuffed, and arrested. The footage showed everything. A law professor being detained for walking across his own campus. The hashtag #IceArrestsProf began trending within 6 hours. Legal Twitter erupted with constitutional scholars sharing the videos and explaining the violations in real time. CNN picked up the story by evening news. MSNBC led with it. Fox News covered it as an example of federal overreach. The story crossed political lines. Everyone could see the absurdity of arresting someone for violating laws he had written. ICE agent arrests professor who wrote immigration enforcement guidelines. Constitutional law expert detained for teaching while Latino. ICE violates Constitution, written by professor they arrested. Federal agent arrests American citizen who authored federal training manual. The outrage was immediate and intense across the political spectrum. Conservative legal scholars condemned the constitutional violations. Liberal activists pointed to systemic racism. University presidents nationwide issued statements defending academic freedom. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement condemning the arrest. The American Association of University Professors demanded accountability. Columbia University's president called it an assault on academic freedom and constitutional rights. By midnight, the story had international coverage. The BBC covered it as an example of American immigration enforcement chaos. International legal scholars expressed disbelief that someone could be arrested for violating guidelines he had authored. Morrison's life imploded within 24 hours. Administrative leave, federal investigation launched, and his name permanently associated with constitutional violation. ICE issued a statement distancing the agency from his actions and announcing comprehensive review of enforcement procedures. Morrison released a brief statement through his attorney. "I responded to a call about suspicious activity. I followed what I believed were proper procedures. I regret any misunderstanding." Dr. Rivera contacted the law firm of Goldberg and Associates, specialists in federal civil rights litigation, within 48 hours of his release. The lawsuit named Morrison individually, Assistant Director Walsh for supervisory failure, and the Department of Homeland Security for systematic constitutional violations. The claims were extensive and damning. Unlawful arrest and detention without probable cause, violation of 4th and 14th Amendment rights, racial profiling and ethnic discrimination, false imprisonment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, denial of due process under federal civil rights statutes, violation of university campus protections under federal education law, supervisory liability for failure to train and monitor agents with documented patterns of constitutional violations. The complaint included Morrison's complete disciplinary record, 23 complaints over 6 years, 15 involving allegations of racial profiling, 8 sustained violations with inadequate discipline, a pattern of targeting Latino individuals based on ethnicity rather than reasonable suspicion. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division conducted an independent review of Morrison's record and reached a devastating conclusion: systematic constitutional violations with supervisory knowledge and inadequate response. The evidence was overwhelming: videos, witnesses, documentation, and Rivera's unimpeachable credentials. The federal government settled exactly 14 months after the incident. $4.5 million paid to Dr. Marcus Rivera. Additional terms required the Department of Homeland Security to implement new constitutional training based on Rivera's guidelines, establish independent oversight for campus enforcement actions, and create mandatory reporting for any detention of American citizens. Morrison was terminated 11 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was final and comprehensive. Agent Morrison detained a United States citizen without constitutional justification, ignored federal training requirements, and engaged in racial profiling. Despite 23 prior complaints and multiple supervisory interventions, Agent Morrison continued to demonstrate systematic disregard for constitutional protections. His employment is terminated immediately, and his federal law enforcement credentials permanently revoked. Morrison's name was entered into federal databases, permanently barring him from law enforcement employment. His 6-year career ended at age 34 without possibility of appeal. The ICE Agents Union reviewed the case file, examined the video evidence, and declined to contest the termination. Morrison released a final statement. "I made errors in judgment. I accept responsibility for my actions, but I was responding to a complaint about suspicious activity and followed procedures as I understood them." Dr. Rivera testified before the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship. His testimony was measured, authoritative, and devastating. "I am Dr. Marcus Rivera, professor of constitutional law at Columbia University. For 8 years, I have taught federal immigration law, constitutional protections, and civil rights. I have published extensively on 4th Amendment protections during immigration enforcement. I have consulted with the Department of Homeland Security to develop constitutional training for ICE agents." He paused, looking directly at the committee members. "On October 15th, I was walking across my own university campus to teach a constitutional law class when ICE Agent Derek Morrison demanded that I prove my citizenship. I showed him my faculty credentials, my driver's license, and my university identification. He dismissed all of them as potentially fake. When I told him I was a naturalized American citizen and a law professor, he said he didn't care if I had written the Constitution." Another pause, his voice strengthening. "The irony is devastating. Agent Morrison violated the exact constitutional guidelines I had written for his department. Every procedural protection I had carefully crafted to prevent ethnic profiling and unlawful detention, he ignored all of them. He demanded papers based on my ethnicity and my presence on a university campus. He arrested an American citizen for the crime of teaching constitutional law while Latino. Rivera's voice carried the weight of legal authority. Agent Morrison had 23 complaints in 6 years. 15 involving allegations of racial profiling. The pattern was documented, extensive, and ignored by supervisors who prioritized apprehensions over constitutional compliance. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a federal agent who believed his badge gave him authority to demand papers from any Latino person he encountered. He looked directly at the committee members. The Department of Homeland Security paid $4.5 million to settle this case. That represents accountability, but it doesn't undo the constitutional violation of being arrested on my own campus. It doesn't restore the dignity of being handcuffed in front of my students. And it doesn't answer the larger question: if this can happen to me, with my credentials, my citizenship, and my expertise, what happens to everyone else? The committee room was silent. Should racial profiling by federal agents trigger automatic federal civil rights investigations? Drop your answer. This wasn't just about one afternoon on a university campus. This was about a federal agency that allowed Agent Morrison to accumulate 23 complaints over 6 years without meaningful consequences. This was about a system that validated ethnic profiling until someone with resources and expertise fought back. Morrison's record told the story his supervisors chose to ignore. 23 complaints over 6 years, 15 involving the same constitutional violations. Every single one resolved with training that Morrison never internalized. The pattern was clear, documented, and legally indefensible. But ICE treated each incident separately, never connecting the dots, never acknowledging that 23 complaints represent systematic constitutional violations, not isolated mistakes. Agent Morrison's career is over. That's justice. The federal government paid $4.5 million. That's accountability. New constitutional training based on Dr. Rivera's guidelines is now mandatory. That's reform. But settlements don't undo the trauma of being arrested for existing while Latino. Terminations don't restore the dignity of being handcuffed on your own campus. And new training doesn't erase the message that even writing the law isn't enough to protect you from agents who don't understand it. The real question is, what changes now? Do federal agencies finally remove agents after 10 complaints instead of 23? Do supervisors finally recognize that patterns of racial profiling represent systematic constitutional violations? Do we finally acknowledge that looking suspicious cannot be code for being Latino in spaces where someone decided you don't belong? Because if we don't fix the system that kept Morrison in field operations despite 23 documented constitutional violations, if we don't address the culture that taught him to see Latino faces as immigration enforcement opportunities, then we're just waiting for the next agent, the next professor, the next American citizen arrested for the crime of existing while Latino. Dr. Rivera's case represents something deeper than individual prejudice. It exposes how institutional bias operates through federal law enforcement. It's not just about one agent's ignorance. It's about a system that prioritizes enforcement statistics over constitutional compliance. It's about supervisors who tolerate documented patterns of civil rights violations. It's about training that teaches agents what the law requires but fails to address the racial assumptions that prevent them from following it. When bias is backed by federal authority, by badges, weapons, and detention powers, it doesn't just harm individuals. It sends a message that citizenship isn't enough, credentials aren't enough, and constitutional expertise isn't enough to protect you from agents who see ethnicity as evidence of illegality. Comment if you believe this should be law. Federal agents who violate constitutional rights based on racial profiling face automatic termination and permanent law enforcement disqualification. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with awareness and change starts with pressure, then hit that subscribe button. We're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing these patterns. We're going to keep demanding constitutional compliance from the agents sworn to uphold it. We're going to keep fighting for the professors, the citizens, and the constitutional principles that protect all of us. This isn't just about one ICE agent or one law professor. It's about all of us and the Constitution we choose to enforce or ignore.